In Hollywood's golden age, the cameras didn't just record, they demanded. They demanded perfection in a world that didn't allow it. You could be a genius, a star, a living myth. But if a flaw appeared, even for a second, the studio would bury it. Not because they hated you, because they needed you to stay unreal. They needed you to remain untouched by time, untouched by illness, untouched by anything that would remind audiences that the people on screen were human. The thing is, the stars knew this. They understood that every breath, every step, every smile had to be measured, polished, and performed. But what the audience didn't know, what they could never know, was how much pain and fear was kept behind the curtain. How many of them were living on borrowed strength, hidden behind the brightest lights the world had ever seen. And the more you study their lives, the more you realize the truth. The most dangerous secret in Hollywood wasn't scandal. It wasn't divorce or gambling or affairs. It was the quiet fact that some of its greatest legends were sick, injured, and suffering, yet still expected to act like they were immortal. What follows isn't a list of famous names. It's a story of what it meant to be perfect when perfection was a prison. These are the moments the cameras never caught, the long, private hours where a star learned to breathe through pain, to smile through fear, to keep going because stopping would mean the end of everything they'd built. Because in the studio system, illness wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a business problem, a problem to be hidden, a problem to be managed, a problem to be fixed if it could be fixed at all. And so, some stars did what stars do best. They became actors not only on screen, but in their own lives. They became their own masks. When John Wayne returned to the screen after losing a lung, it wasn't just a comeback. It was a private act of rebellion. In the public eye, Wayne was the embodiment of a certain kind of American myth, big, unshakable, indestructible. He was the man who could ride into a storm and still look like he owned the sky. But behind that myth was a body that had been forced to relearn the simplest human act, breathing. He didn't hide his illness the way others did. He didn't retreat into silence or secrecy. Instead, he stepped into the spotlight and made his struggle part of his image, part of the story that made people believe he was stronger than death itself. Yet even his openness was a kind of performance. Because the truth was, Wayne's breathing was never natural again. Every time he walked across a set, every time he ran or fought or rode, his body had to work harder than anyone realized. The high-altitude scene that nearly made him pass out wasn't just a dramatic moment on film. It was a reminder that the myth of invincibility had a human cost. Wayne's decision to keep going, his whispered "keep going, we're almost there," wasn't just bravery. It was desperation. He knew that if the cameras stopped, the world might finally see what he had become, a man who had been forced to pretend he wasn't broken. That's the thing about Hollywood's golden age. It wasn't only about glamour. It was about survival. And for Wayne, survival meant turning pain into a performance. Marilyn Monroe's life was a series of careful corrections, not just of her hair, her voice, her posture, or her wardrobe, but of the way she moved through the world. The studios didn't just want her to be beautiful. They wanted her to be flawless, and flawlessness required control. It required hiding anything that might make the audience doubt the illusion. That's why her foot deformity mattered so much, not because it made her less talented, less worthy, or less lovable, but because it made her human, and Hollywood couldn't allow its leading woman to be human. So Marilyn learned to walk like someone else. She practiced poses until her body hurt. She learned to move in a way that erased the evidence of her own bones. But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way the industry treated her pain as if it were a nuisance. Endometriosis wasn't just a medical condition. It was a disruption in the carefully crafted story of Marilyn Monroe. When her body failed her, the studio demanded she keep performing. When she was in agony, they told her to smile. When she needed rest, they told her to be grateful for the spotlight. She became a living contradiction, the sex symbol who couldn't move without pain, the icon of confidence who was terrified of being exposed. The tragedy wasn't just that she suffered. It was that she suffered alone in a world that had no room for vulnerability. And when she died, the world mourned the legend, not the woman. But those who knew her knew the truth. Marilyn Monroe wasn't a goddess. She was a person forced to pretend she was one. James Dean's legend was built on a single concept: rebellion. But what people saw as rebellion was often simply the visible expression of a struggle he could never fully escape. His eyes, the way they seemed distant, almost haunted, weren't just acting. They were a coping mechanism. He was living in a world where he couldn't fully trust his senses, and he learned to compensate with something else: intuition, intensity, instinct. He was severely nearsighted, almost blind without glasses, and he was partially deaf in one ear. This isn't the kind of detail that Hollywood would celebrate. It's not glamorous. It doesn't add to the myth. It complicates it. But it also explains the way he moved through scenes, the way he reacted to other actors, the way he seemed to exist slightly out of sync with the world. He wasn't distant because he was emotionally detached. He was distant because he was constantly working to fill in the missing pieces. He had to memorize the exact position of people in the room. He had to read lips. He had to guess what was happening in the periphery. And in a world where every moment was photographed, every mistake could be replayed, he learned to become an actor not only of emotion, but of survival. When he died at 24, people didn't just lose a star. They lost a young man who had been fighting a private battle in plain sight. And the tragedy of his death wasn't just that it was sudden. It was that he never got to fully reveal the person behind the performance. Elizabeth Taylor's beauty was a kind of tragedy, not because she was ugly, far from it, but because the very thing people worshipped was the thing that hid her suffering. Her violet eyes weren't just rare. They were a sign of something unusual in her genetics, a unique marker that made her stand out. And Hollywood loved that. Hollywood loved her because she looked like a dream. But her body was not a dream. From childhood, she suffered from a congenital heart condition and scoliosis. She spent months bedridden as a child, and as she grew older, she learned that her body would never be as strong as it looked. The studio lights did not care about her spine. The camera did not care about her heart. When she wore gowns and smiled and moved through the world like a goddess, she was doing more than acting. She was hiding a lifetime of pain. The brace she wore under her clothes wasn't a costume. It was a secret. The stiffness in her back wasn't a posture. It was reality. And the surgeries, so many surgeries, weren't just medical procedures. They were battles fought in silence, away from the public's gaze. The fact that she could appear at red carpets days after operations was not evidence of strength. It was evidence of the price she paid to remain untouchable. Her legend was built on beauty, but her life was shaped by fragility. And the contradiction is what made her so unforgettable. Paul Newman was the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a world where everything was easy. He had that effortless charm, that confidence that seemed to come naturally. But the truth is, Newman had to work harder than most people to survive the simplest things. He was colorblind. Not the kind of colorblind that makes everything black and white. The kind that makes certain colors blend together, making warnings harder to distinguish, making signals confusing. In a race car, that's not a minor inconvenience. It's a risk. It's a danger. It's a potential death sentence. And yet Newman didn't quit. He didn't give up his love for speed or the thrill of racing. Instead, he adapted. He memorized tracks. He learned the feel of the car. He relied on sound and vibration and instinct. He didn't tell the world. He didn't announce his limitation. He simply refused to let it define him. And that's what makes his story so powerful. Because it shows something that Hollywood rarely admits. Talent is not the same as perfection. Sometimes, talent is the ability to keep going when the world expects you to stop. When Newman stood on the podium at Daytona at age 70, it wasn't just a victory. It was proof that the human spirit can overcome what the body cannot. Audrey Hepburn's beauty is often described as fragile, but that fragility wasn't a choice. It was the result of a childhood that broke her body before the world ever saw her face. She was 11 when the war began, and the war didn't just take food and safety. It took her health. She survived on tulip bulbs and wild grass. Her body grew tall, but it remained thin and weak. Her immune system never fully recovered. She carried the damage with her for the rest of her life. Yet when she stepped into the studio lights, she did not appear broken. She appeared luminous. She appeared like someone who had never known suffering. And that's the cruel irony. The beauty that made her famous was born from the pain that nearly destroyed her. Between takes, she suffered from stomach pain and exhaustion, but she never let it show. She turned her fragility into a new standard of beauty, one that was different from the era's ideal, one that challenged the old norms. She became a symbol not of physical perfection, but of grace under pressure. And perhaps that's why her later humanitarian work felt so authentic. She didn't just speak about suffering. She had lived it. She understood what it meant to be hungry, weak, and powerless. Her life was a reminder that the most luminous stars are often the ones who have lived through the darkest nights. Steve McQueen was built for danger. That was his brand. He didn't just play the action hero, he lived it. He performed his own stunts, drove his own cars, jumped his own motorcycles. He didn't want to be replaced. He didn't want to be limited. He wanted to be real. But the real danger came later, in a way no stunt could prepare him for. In 1979, he was diagnosed with mesothelioma, a rare cancer linked to asbestos exposure. And the exposure wasn't from a factory or a shipyard. It was from the sets, the costumes, the props, the very environments that had once been his playground. The cruelty of the disease is that it shows up late, when the body has already been damaged beyond repair. By the time McQueen knew what he was fighting, it was already too late. Yet he refused to surrender. He sought treatments, including controversial ones. He traveled, he fought, he kept his humor. In his final months, he joked about escaping explosions, as if he could outrun death the way he outran danger on screen. But the truth was, he couldn't. And the irony is devastating. The man who lived for risk died from a danger no one could see. McQueen's story is a reminder that Hollywood's greatest heroes are not always killed by villains. Sometimes they're killed by the very world that made them legends. Sean Connery's James Bond was the perfect image of control. The man in the tuxedo, the calm voice, the effortless dominance. But Connery's perfection was built on a hidden weakness. He was deaf in one ear. It wasn't a secret he was ashamed of. He didn't hide it because he was embarrassed. He hid it because the world didn't allow imperfection. In the world of Bond, every sound mattered. Every footstep, every whisper, every distant explosion. And Connery had to pretend he could hear it all. On set, he adjusted his position. He read lips. He relied on the rhythm of scenes. And in the process, he turned his disability into a kind of skill. He learned to focus on what he could control. He learned to listen with his eyes. The tragedy is that audiences never knew. They never saw the effort behind the performance. They only saw the result. The man who never looked surprised, never looked lost, never looked unsure. But the truth is, Connery's strength wasn't just in his charm. It was in his ability to keep going despite a limitation that would have destroyed a lesser actor. And that's the real reason he became Bond. Not because he was flawless, but because he refused to let flaws define him. Kirk Douglas survived a helicopter crash that killed others. The world saw the miracle. They saw the man who lived. They saw the legend who refused to die. But they didn't see what he carried afterward. A spine that never healed properly, a body that was always in pain. The crash didn't just injure him. It changed his relationship with his own strength. He had always been the warrior, the man of steel. But suddenly, every step was a reminder that his body could betray him. Doctors told him to rest. They told him to stay still. But Douglas was a man who didn't know how to stop. He returned to the set months later, standing tall, acting as if nothing had happened. The pain was there, hidden behind the calm expression. The fatigue was there, masked by the familiar charisma. In Hollywood, pain is not a story. It's a liability. So Douglas turned his pain into a secret and continued to perform. He continued to act like the hero he always played. But in private, he knew the truth. The man who survived the crash was not the same man who walked into it. He was a man who had learned how fragile life could be. And that fragility is what made him human, even as the world continued to see him as a legend. Ray Milland's career was built on silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the silence of a body that cannot hear. He lost nearly all hearing in one ear while serving in the Royal Air Force. It was a quiet injury, but it was also a severe one. In a world where actors rely on cues, timing, and sound, Milland had to learn to operate without one of his senses. He became a master lip reader. He learned to anticipate scenes. He learned to feel the rhythm of a conversation rather than hear it. On set, he made it look effortless. He delivered lines like he could hear them clearly. He moved through scenes as if the world was speaking directly to him. And because he didn't draw attention to his disability, the audience never suspected. But the cost was real. He had to work harder than anyone else. He had to stay more focused. He had to compensate constantly. That's the thing about Hollywood's golden age. It rewarded effort only if it remained invisible. Milland's strength wasn't just his acting talent. It was his ability to hide the struggle and still make the performance feel natural. And in a way, that's what made him a true star, because stars aren't born. They're built one hidden sacrifice at a time. Rock Hudson's secret wasn't just illness. It was the fear of being discovered in a world that would punish him for being different. He was the romantic ideal, the dream man, the image of masculinity that Hollywood sold to millions. But he lived in a world where his private life could destroy his public image. When he was diagnosed with HIV in 1984, he didn't immediately announce it. He didn't immediately step away. He continued to work. He continued to appear in public. He continued to live as if nothing had changed. But inside, the world was collapsing. He knew what the disease meant. He knew the stigma. He knew the fear. And he knew that if the truth came out, it would not only end his career, it could ruin his life. When he finally revealed his illness, it was not just a personal confession. It was a moment that changed America. People who had once viewed HIV as a distant, shameful thing suddenly saw it in a familiar face. They saw it in someone they had admired. Hudson's illness forced the world to confront a truth it had avoided for too long. That disease does not discriminate. That fear is often born from ignorance. And that even the most perfect image can hide a life full of struggle. His death was not just a tragedy. It was a turning point. Rita Hayworth's transformation began before she even became famous. When she signed with the studio, she was asked to become someone else entirely. Her name was changed. Her hair was dyed. Her features were altered. She was made into an icon. But the cost of that transformation was deeper than anyone realized. It wasn't just her appearance. It was her identity. The studio didn't just create a new image, they created a new person. And for Rita, the change was both liberating and damaging. She gained fame, but she lost something else, a sense of self that could not be replaced by glamour. Later, when she began showing signs of Alzheimer's, the world didn't understand. They mistook her symptoms for drunkenness. They laughed at her confusion. They turned her into a joke. But behind the laughter was a woman losing herself. A woman whose mind was slipping away, piece by piece, in public. Her daughter eventually revealed the truth, and suddenly the world saw the real tragedy. A woman who had been forced to perform for decades, who had been asked to hide her pain, was now being judged for something no one could control. Rita Hayworth's story is not just about transformation. It's about how Hollywood's demand for perfection can destroy a person from the inside out. Gary Cooper's final years were defined by pain, not the dramatic pain of a heroic battle. The quiet, grinding pain of a body breaking down, back injuries from years of horseback riding and performing stunts, painkiller injections before filming, a slow decline that no one wanted to talk about. He wasn't a star who wanted sympathy. He was a star who wanted to keep working. He wanted to keep being the hero. He wanted to keep the illusion alive. Even after being diagnosed with prostate cancer, he didn't step away. He continued to appear in public, smiling, charming, appearing unbroken. He refused to let his illness define him. But the illness was there. It was always there. It was in the way he moved. It was in the way he held himself. It was in the way his body gradually grew weaker, even as his legend grew stronger. When he finally admitted he would not return to the set, it was not just a statement. It was a surrender. a quiet acknowledgement that even the greatest heroes eventually run out of strength. And in that surrender, there was a kind of honesty that Hollywood rarely allowed. Humphrey Bogart's illness was the kind that slowly steals the voice of a person. Esophageal cancer, late-stage diagnosis, weight loss, pain with every swallow, the kind of illness that makes every meal a battle. Bogart was the man who made silence feel powerful. His voice was his weapon. His calm was his armor. And the disease attacked the very thing that made him iconic. When doctors told him to stop acting, he refused. Not because he was stubborn, because acting was his life. It was the thing that made him feel alive. On set, he continued to perform with the same detached confidence audiences loved. But behind that calm exterior was a man fighting a body that was betraying him. His final scenes were not just performances. They were acts of defiance. He wasn't just playing a character. He was playing the role of a man who refused to be defeated. And the tragedy of Bogart's story is that the audience never got to see the full truth. They never saw the pain behind the cool. They only saw the myth. But the myth was built on suffering. And that suffering is what made his performances feel so real. These stories are not simply about famous names. They are about what it meant to be human in a world that demanded gods. The studio system didn't just create stars. It created illusions. It created legends that could never show weakness. And the stars, for their part, learned to survive within those illusions. They learned to hide their pain. They learned to perform not only for the audience, but for the world itself. They learned that vulnerability was a liability. They learned to turn suffering into silence. But the truth has a way of breaking through. It always does. Eventually, the mask cracks. Eventually, the hidden truth becomes visible. And when that happens, we are forced to confront something uncomfortable, that the people we idolize are not invincible. They are not gods. They are human beings who carried their pain in private, who performed in public, and who paid a price the world never saw. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of these stories is not the illness itself. It's the fact that the world loved them more as legends than it ever could have loved them as people. But maybe, now, we can begin to change that. Maybe we can learn to see the person behind the star. Maybe we can recognize that perfection is not the goal. Survival is. And perhaps, in understanding their pain, we can finally appreciate their courage, not for what they did on screen, but for what they endured off it.